Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be talking frivolously with much gravitas on economic principles with Kris. Kris has been following major world markets since his teenage years in high school, where he began as a self-study on foreign exchange markets, currency markets, Forex or FX markets. After opening and trading for a few years on practice accounts, he opened his first real money account at 19 and later founded a financial institution of his own in the spring of 2007, right before the financial crisis. After his bank was decimated by the financial crisis, he began studying politics and stock markets in an effort to understand how the world's financial systems could have been left so vulnerable to the collapse. His foray into political structures and corporate finance would soon become his daily passion. And here he's aiming to demystify the complexity and offer perspective through jargon based based on his practical experience following financial news and professional experience analyzing charts and central banks' actions in FX markets over the last 15 to 20 years. I think that covers everything. So I think we should start by going through the jargon itself, defining our terms quickly so that we know what we're talking about, because we've talked about this before in person, where economics seems to be this Byzantine, almost priesthood, where you have to know the inwards and the outwards and what's going on, when in reality, a lot of it just kind of relies on a enforced complexity almost.
Mm-hmm. And such is the way with most complex integrated systems, right? So anytime you're talking to a baker about mixing ingredients, they'll invariably talk about recipes, and recipe is basically a jargon for bakers, right? But the problem I think a lot of people stumble upon with economics is they assume that the science of economics is itself a typical science, which it's not really. It's sort of akin to philosophy in the sense that it's dealing with dynamic changes in systems. So you're more interested in the interrelatedness of the response reactions between systems than you are interested in the quantized numbers between the two systems, because the quanta are they're flawed, and not just fallible, but they're guaranteed to be flawed, and we'll get into that in a sec. But some of the jargon can't really be overstepped before talking about it, just because, like with baking, you need to know how to speak about pots and pans. So basically what I'll just cover quickly is the jargon that's sort of necessary just to understand concepts. And then hopefully for the rest of the time, we can skip all the BS and just talk about principles. Principles being the first word of jargon, I guess. When I'm talking about principles of economics, I'm talking about the idea or concept of. That's the dynamicness of it. So the formula as opposed to the equation, or I guess the equation will work too, but the algebra as opposed to the solution is what we're getting at. So first and foremost, we'll have to talk about scale and scope, and that's sort of summarized in macro and micro. Now, these words aren't definitively defined as anything above X is macro and anything below X is micro. Micro is just a relative term to macro. So anytime we're talking about anything, especially today, but in economics in general, even when people speak of absolutes, they're not talking absolute terms. They're talking about absolute formula. And the formula themselves are assumed to be flawed, but they're useful, so we use them anyway. But it's really important to keep in mind that the formula aren't written in stone. They're not laws of nature. They're not perfect absolutes. They're all relative terms to each other, and it's only useful.
Kind of like how Newton's theorems and equations are still useful, even though they don't really describe the entire truth of the universe.
Right. So with a falling object
levels, they are.
Oh, sorry.
No, yeah, exactly. Probably what you're going to say there. On a certain scale, is they're extremely useful, but once you get to the molecular or submolecular scale, it's there's no use for them. But once you get to like a universal scale, they're also not that useful anymore, because
So molecular dynamics would be like an idea of micro versus macro, where Newtonian would be macro. So you could drop a ball, and it'll fall according to Newtonian formula, but that doesn't really factor in wind resistance and turbulence and temperature, because air densities change based on temperature, et cetera, because we live in a giant fluid, right? But at the same
yeah.
token,
Well, why didn't
molecular
you take
dynamics,
Brownian motion into account?
yeah. But in the same token, like molecular dynamics could also be considered macro if you're relating them to quantum mechanics, where quantum mechanics doesn't care about air at all because it's smaller than air. So it doesn't,
Yeah.
it's not affected by fluid dynamics because it's subfluid. So yeah, scarcity of resources being the second most important jargon topic. And I mean, it's not really a jargon term, but it's important enough to underpin it right from the get-go, because economics only makes sense, and only it's only reasonable to discuss markets if there's a scarcity at play. If there's no scarcity of resources, there's no need to economize anything. You can just be wasteful, and you just have yeah, it's self-explanatory, I guess. But scarcity of resources is fundamental to even discussing economics, because it's just nonsensical without it. It's like dividing by zero doesn't make sense in math. Supply and
So
demand.
for scarcity of resource, oh, sorry to go back. So scarcity of resources, you're saying, is fundamental because the whole point of making a trade on any level is because you want something or need something that you don't have or you cannot get through any other way, or
Yeah,
something like that. So the lack of something creates, and the lack plus the need of something creates a necessity to get that something, and that causes economics to happen, or
and
trade being
discussing
the
efficiencies, like the only reason that efficiency matters to us is that we're trying to get some benefit from it. I mean, if there was no benefit to be gained from an efficient process, there'd be no reason to even have a process. You'd just act willy-nilly and let chips fall where they may. But by design and
right. But
construction, if
if
we're
you
trying to produce something useful and we're trying to do it in the best way possible, we look for efficiencies and economies for this reason, because of a scarcity of time,
right, because it's
scarcity of building material, or
right. If I sell you a bunch of rocks that you want to use to build a wall or something, and I'm another town over, you come pick them up yourself, and you say, okay, I've got the rocks. But if I say, okay, but I'll let you rent my horse and the cart for just a couple bucks for the feed, I guess, and then you can bring all that stuff there quicker. So you can do more stuff with your time. You can not be exhausted when you're done. And then the wall is easier to build. And then you have a wall for a longer time, which you can use to delineate space, because that's what you paid for the wall for, or protection, or to stop wind or whatever. And it's useful for a longer time because you were more efficient. And
thanks for
so
mentioning that too, because scarcity also applies to things like people's abilities and their age, right? So like for an 80-year-old
yeah,
woman, it's probably a scarce resource, the energy it takes to haul rocks from one place to another, versus for, say, a 15-year-old to do the same work for that 80-year-old woman. They can exchange their labor in different ways because they have scarcity of energy or strength, capacity. So all that falls into scarcity too, just even basic capacity and willpower or desire, access, geography, all that kind of thing.
yeah. I remember helping people shovel gravel when I was a teenager, and it was essentially just paid exercise at that point.
Yeah,
So,
which they appreciate because they
which
can't
is
do it as
also good for
well, and
me.
you appreciate because you would have had to do it anyway because you exercise. So that's sort of what
Yeah,
we're getting to when we talk about synergies, though, is the economics and cost versus benefit being the next item of note on my list of jargon. Cost benefit analysis is something we all do. Oh,
were we going to get into supply and demand?
yeah, I was gonna do it with the cost benefit analysis though, and kind of jumble them.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah,
sorry.
no problem. So with the cost benefit analysis, it's things that we all do when we're deciding what we need and what we want to gain. So that can come down to our time or our labor or energy, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the last three items that we note, scarcity, supply and demand, and cost benefit, the three of them kind of go together in the sense that you can't have a demand for something if you don't have scarcity, and you can't weigh cost benefit if you don't have scarcity and supply. So the ideas are intertwined, and that's why it's kind of important to know the jargon, because you really will wind up tripping on ourselves over and over and over again over the same idea without having some jargon that we can just like casually brush it all off to. So the reason we talk about scarcity, supply and demand, and cost benefit is because they all work together, and you could at any one point sort of circle back to the beginning of all of them if you only look at them one at a time individually. So just for the sake of productive discussion, economists have to use the jargon so that we understand what we're saying when we use the jargon, but not to say in absolute terms that this item is scarce because nobody has it. That's not what scarcity means. It just means that there's a limited quantity. And supply also infers that. You can't have a supply of something and have it be infinite. A supply infers that there's a cap to it, or a maximum, or a limit. And demand implies that there's a need that's unfulfilled. So that's sort of like the inverse of supply. It's a supply of want. It's people have a stockpile of wanting something they don't have, and that's implied by scarcity. And
Okay.
is that clear, or did I just sort of trip on my own tongue?
No, it sounded, it made a lot of sense.
Okay, just double
mulling
check.
it over in my head, fitting it in, letting it settle
We'll
in
get
there,
deeper
so.
into it when we have examples and stuff. It's sort of just I wanna make it really clear that fundamentally I'm not saying that that there are defined definite terms used because they mean specific numbers. They're used as concepts so that we can productively discuss things further than that, deeper layers of abstraction.
Oh, okay. So like instead of saying supply and demand equals well supply, well, or if at this level then this happens, blah blah blah. No, it's a lot more fluid than that. These are just words that we use in order, like as a
tool.
Is a tool. They're little symbols that mean greater things, so that we only have to say one word instead of saying an entire book of something.
Right. Yeah. That's
so
exactly
like when you say something like, well, it's yeah. Oh no, go on.
That's why they talk about curves too. Usually you'll hear economists talk about a supply and demand curve. It's because they're trying to reinforce the fact that there's no actual number there. What it is an equilibrium between two variables. And those variables have ranges, and those ranges are constantly shifting and moving based on environmental factors or market influences or whatever the case is.
Right, but the curve is a general trend through changing numbers rather than it's well, it was here and now it's here. But now it's here relative to this, so it's yes.
And then lastly, I wanted to mention, and then we'll get off the whole jargon subject and we'll start with the more tangible and realistic analogies. But motivations or incentives or subsidies, anything that is like exterior to our economic model that we're discussing, that's like imposed on the model to affect some type of change, is a type of incentive. And the reason we do this is because it's not always in the best interest to just spend or use what we have just because we have it available to us now. As creatures with foresight and planning and education, we're capable of managing our resources for a longer term than just an immediate term. Well, usually oil is a bad example, but it's also a good example of this, where if oil was free, like if coal was cheap, they would just burn it and pollute the air for no reason other than the fact that it was cheap. And it's not because they couldn't do anything otherwise. It's just that they'd have no reason to or motivation except for if they're thinking in the long term, which presumably we would want to do because that would be the path of wisdom, right? Having some kind of plan moving forward benefits us all in the long
Right.
run.
Well, the oil companies and they probably would want to not just, it'd be like, okay, we're making tons of money if we're just burning the stuff, but people have to pay us to burn it. And so if someone was buying it just to burn it, then we wouldn't care. But if someone's burning it to turn it into a product and say, well, look at what we're doing with the oil that we bought from you guys, well, that's in our interest to look good. Like we're building anti-landmine robots with the plastic made from thing, and we're saving people. It's like the oil company's gonna be like, yes, I'm gonna sell to that guy more because he's giving me this publicity that he's giving me is a great incentive for me to deal with him rather than the guy who's just burning it in his backyard by the barrel. Why is he doing that?
So a lot of the times governments will incentivize different sectors of the market. And the reason they'll do this is because, for instance, they'll want to prop up a food supply chain because it's in everyone's best interest to always have food available. And if the cost to that is subsidizing farmers so that they have a stable income and a stable living where they can plan for future crops, it benefits us all year over year and generation over generation.
Right.
So another example.
Those subsidies are, oh yeah, go on.
Oh, if you're going to go on to subsidies, I was going to change the subject, so ask.
So yeah, just subsidies are a touchy topic with some, but I feel like a lot of, like for the farmers one, they do want food to be available, and that's definitely showing up to be a thing that's helped definitely in the COVID response, where nobody's really starving at the moment. There's no famine wafting across the land because of it, at least in North America. And it shows that those subsidies or the food generation policies that we've had have generally been good, at least up until now. But there's a lot of like subsidies for random companies or lobbies that are looking for subsidies for their business because they're trying to claim that they are a necessary part of the economy. But at that point, you get people trying to figure out why. I guess it's the person at the top that's deciding who's the subsidy, who's going to get the money and the incentive, right?
Yeah. And that's definitely a really contentious point of interest, and I'd like to get into that too, because I think how we decide what incentives and subsidies and motivations to offer, which sectors and how much and how often, and that whole structure comes down to being able to competently analyze our economy as a whole and decide what to do with it from there. So when you think about the science of economics being something of dynamic and principles and concepts, this is the reason we do it, is so that we can make smarter decisions about things like subsidies and incentives. So it sort of brings us back to the whole reason for the study, even though it's imprecise and inaccurate, where it's useful and why we do it. Often in economics, in economic terms, we'll talk about utility, and I'm sort of going to brush past it a little bit, but not really get into it because there's an ism for utilitarianism that it's the more extreme design of being strictly focused on utility, and we can talk about that in a bit if you want to, but it's not really a principle of economics. It's more of a school of thought. It's an idea of how things should run rather than economics as a study or a subject.
Yeah, I found utilitarianism to be more useful on a personal scale than on a global scale, because then you end up with the trolley problem. Well, do I kill nation A or nation B? Well, that's not a good question. And Mill would have even probably scoffed at that. But on a personal level, it's like, which one should I buy? Well, this one's made by a guy, and this one's made somewhere in Asia. So I'm probably going to buy this one because this one's going to cause the most utility good in my neighborhood. Or you walk up to a person, should I greet them pleasantly or should I just, not make eye contact? Well, the moral thing would be to, be pleasant and cause the most utility and good in your neighborhood. But so it gets a little complicated when you get even to the scope of something like a family or community. So it's easy to ask yourself, what can I do that will cause the most good?
It does get a bit more nebulous the larger back you stand and the higher perspective, but it just changes the thing that's utile. So like from a more macro, larger scale, if you're thinking about the human good, you can start thinking about what your country should offer another country, nation A or nation B, in order to look after the utility of the human race as a whole. So it really depends on scale and scope. When that's why I like to say like the micro and macro thing is all relative to each other in discussion. They're not absolute terms in and of themselves.
Right. So keep thinking back to like, what does my community need? Well, it needs something to get that carbon out of the air. So I'm going to invest my money in this carbon capture technology or in planting trees or something, or in that guy that's like cleaning up the rivers around the world with his like river cleaning robots, which
dredgers.
That guy's a hero. Or those guys that are like, is this the same guy that's also like cleaning up the oceans? He just started a company to do it and he's figuring out how to make a profit out of it. So you have this, how do we go here? You have this need, which, and he's doing the cost benefit analysis and he's running this thing to make benefit out of something that is a necessity. But what resources is he filling with these scarcity? Well, he's pulling up a ton of plastic, so he's got a ton of plastic on hand. Where is there a scarcity of resources with plastic? Well, in manufacturing. So you sell it back to manufacturers, make a profit. Manufacturers end up paying for their own cleanup.
Yeah.
So,
and a good way of using subsidies in that example might be to subsidize the recycling company, tax the plastic makers to pay for the subsidy of the recycling companies. And then the recycling company's got a cost benefit analysis where they personally gain from having an operating business that is funded by taxpayer dollars. That in purely economic and utilitarian terms, if you look at it from a small scope, would be wasteful. But when you look at it from longevity of the planet and the human race, it seems so nonsensically obvious that we need to do it. And that's sort of where you get the dichotomy between the ideas of economic principles like free trade, all-encompassing free absolute trade, and that whole like socialism, the boogeyman of socialism, which they just sort of equated from communism, which they equated from dictatorships, and just said, oh, socialism must be dictatorial. I'm like, no, capitalism looks a lot more like a dictatorship when you've got income disparity. But anyway, that's a whole lot.
Yeah, that's another episode.
Yeah. So I was thinking for this one, since we're going to be grounded on fundamental principles, we'd start small and just sort of grow to see like how economics applies, because I want to sort of drive home the fact that economics isn't something that's reserved for the scholars. It's something we all do in our everyday practices. We do it with like our interrelationships with friends, when we choose to smile at our neighbors, like you had mentioned. We do it in all kind of facets of our life. How we decide on whether or not we can afford another pet, like just the simplest decisions, not strictly speaking financial decisions, but all decisions we make are essentially, how am I going to spend my time and energy to live the best life I can? And how do I do that without impacting negatively the lives and livelihoods and freedoms of other people in the process? So the idea is to get the greatest good. And to start that off, I was going to talk about maybe like a small village and how synergy works, because I'd like to really underscore the importance and our motivation for economics in general and for trade and market systems and stuff is essentially to maximize synergies, because that's what benefits us all the most.
All right. Do you want to set the scene first, or do you want to define synergy for us?
I think it's easiest to define it with setting the scene. So, I mean, synergy in a nutshell is just the sum is greater than the parts. Or no, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. In other words,
More hands
1
make
plus
less
1
work.
plus 1 equals 4.
Yes.
So I just had to make sure that was
kind
right.
of well, there's a thing in the hiking when you're hiking. Two people can carry a certain amount, and one person can carry a certain amount in their pack, but they have to carry. They can only carry so much in their pack, and it's heavy. And you have to carry like a water purifier, little stove. You have to carry all your food. You have to carry all your water, or like your water tablets or your water pump. You have to carry your extra clothes, your pack, maybe your tent or your shelter, maybe a tarp if you're thinking. So you want to, nickel and dime this in weight down to nothing. Now, if two people have it, one person can carry the stove. You both still have to carry your clothes and your thing, but someone can carry the pump. You have three people, someone can carry the pots as well as the stove, and then you have four people. Everyone has to carry. So not everyone. The group doesn't need to have more than one water pump, really. So you're not doubling or tripling.
You
so
don't
with every
whole bunch of stoves.
Yeah, you don't need 4 stoves. So these things, when you have 8 hands, you're not just carrying 4 packs. You're actually carrying less than 4 packs, because you don't need that level of redundancy in all the things. In fact, at that point, you start not needing to carry as much food, because one person could carry the food, and you can share some of it. You're going to be sharing the food at that point anyway, so people can carry different food and more varied food. Someone can carry spices because of the room in their pack that they now have, because they don't have to carry a stove because someone else is carrying it. And then you can carry, then all of a sudden someone brings a guitar or something.
Yeah.
And so more hands make lighter work, but it's almost with the word logarithmic work.
Yeah, it's almost. And that's why we talk about curves instead of linear scales usually, because most things in economics and in nature they do work on logarithmic curves, or exponential, parabolic. That's the word I was looking for. So a good example with the hiking though is if you have 2 people and you can now carry a canoe, and you can put things in your canoe, and it's easier and more efficient for you to put a canoe on your shoulder than it is for you to carry a pack over your back. Now you can both not only need to hold less, but you can also both carry more further. So that's what I mean with energy, where you're not just adding your packs together. You can now, between the two of you, carry a canoe and 3 packs, whereas before on foot you could only carry 2 packs in total. So the synergy is
you tie it all to the canoe. Yeah, if you tie all the packs to the canoe, you're all using the canoe, and you use the canoe as a frame while you're portaging.
Right.
6 hands instead of 4 hands will make that canoe a lot lighter. You may need a heavier canoe, but also if you have 3 people instead of 1, those 3 people can also pitch in for a lighter, sturdier canoe, so they have more buying power essentially to buy a high-tech ultralight like space material canoe, rather than that just scrappy aluminum one or something. So,
and it's also like the mechanics
now have
like carrying the canoe is physically easier on your body, so you're capable of doing more with each person than doing it without the canoe at all. But one person isn't big enough to carry the canoe with their pack, so it takes more people to get a greater benefit. And that's sort of the point of, and that's the ultimate goal of economics in general, is to find synergies. the goal isn't just to have more and get more for no reason. The point of it fundamentally is to have more for everybody, so that it's easier for everybody.
So, well, and when you have more for everybody, when one person is, so when your hands aren't, say, doing the cooking, your hands can be set to another task, and you can, I guess, specialize from that. So you can prep or go find firewood, or you can go and build a shelter or set up
Or you can rest.
this. So when you come back from that, you can rest while someone cooks, or you can set up the camp while someone's cooking. And then when you finish setting up the camp, the food will be ready, and everyone has more chance to rest longer. You can sit around and chat, and maybe even go off and explore a bit.
And that means you
do
can
what
choose
you came to do in the
hike
bush.
more. You can choose to cook better variety of food or source better variety of food. You can choose to clean things more.
Mhm.
So like hygiene is what keeps us from getting sick all the time. So there's all these like spillover benefits to synergies. So the point of markets is to sort of have those spillover benefits. Like we don't all need nurses every day, but we all want nurses to exist when we need them. In order to do that, we need some sort of synergies, right? Everybody works, contributes a tiny amount, and when they need it, nurses are available. And it's like the same thing with insurance. The entire reason we buy property insurance and things like that is, sorry, what's that?
I think it's good that nurses are always available.
Yes.
Anyway.
I think that's also good.
Sorry.
No, it's all good. Yeah, so insurance works on the same principle. I mean, if you have 10 fires per year and there's 1,000 people, not all 1,000 people will lose all of their belongings, but at any given point, someone in their lifetime is more than likely, well, I say more than likely, but I just mean more than 50% chance, more than likely to experience a fire at some point in their lives if they live 100 years. Mm-hmm. So,
so we all pitch into a fund, and then the person who is inevitably going to get shafted is able to work their way out. So,
because we don't know who it's going to happen to or when, but we know it's going to happen. It's inevitable.
Mm-hmm. All right.
So I'm going to start breaking it down into the village segment. So I don't know much about farming. And before I even get started, actually, I should offer the caveat that neither of us are certified financial planners. So if you're making financial decisions in your own personal life based off YouTube videos, you're not fit to make your own financial decisions. So full disclosure, don't take anything we say as not here anyway. As
we're more looking at the nature of economics, not well, how can we use
the exploration of thought we're after here. So
what is the market, not how can I use the market?
And the reason why I want to sort of articulate that is because some people are dumb. But
we do know enough to know that covering your butt is a good strategy. So
I kind of have to. So the reason why we want to look at economics from this perspective is because I think the way that we're going about it right now in society is we're just entrusting people in the know or who we expect to have expertise on economics to make policies in government positions, and a lot of people just sort of assume that they are not fit to comment or opine on how the government chooses to subsidize or prefer certain sectors over others. Allocation of monies and budgets, we elect representatives based on their plans, but we don't deem ourselves fit economists, but then we elect people because they're supposed to help the economy, like he who shall not be named, based on some sort of idea that because a rich person is rich, that they're good with economics. But just like my English, I can write, but it doesn't mean I'm an English major.
With very little information, we think that we are an economics master, and we know that if they just put the money here, everything would be fine. Or if they just did this, everything would be fine.
Yeah.
Or if they don't, how stupid are they that they're not doing this thing that I think would work?
By not acknowledging that
in itself. Mhm. It's like, well, you are not seeing the whole picture. You don't know what you're talking about, and that type of reasoning in itself tells me a lot about you. So,
Yeah.
uh, well, here we are.
And from any
So,
enlightened perspective, the more you learn about economics, the more you find the variability can throw it off. It's a lot like turbulence and fluid dynamics, like or the butterfly effect, for lack of another term, something more colloquial. Uh, so yeah, I was thinking to start off, we should talk about like a small confined system so that we discover the point of markets, not by me professing it or lecturing on what it is. I want to show why it's necessary to have a market, and what the benefit is and the use for it. Because once you know fundamentally the philosophy of a market, you can make better decisions about how it should operate. And I think that's what a lot of us are overlooking right now, is that we're looking at some kind of end goal that's been manufactured for us by people who have means. And that was never the intention or purpose as a society to develop a market. So I will start
that
then.
and to avoid any, well, that and also to avoid any uh, just generally tautological thinking, like, uh, well, 19th century he who shall not be named, or certain folks writing manifestos.
Yes.
So any tautological or utopian thinking on either side, either pro or anti-markets, is you're putting the cart before the horse at that point. So
Yeah, anybody
uh,
who doesn't acknowledge that their theories and philosophies are flawed, or that there are constraints to them, anybody who tells you in absolute terms what they know to be true about dynamic systems is just wrong. Because in math there are irrational numbers specifically because they can't be computed. The square root of
when
negative
it starts with,
negative
here's
one.
what I'm thinking so far,
Yeah.
is at a better spot.
You can work with irrational
That
numbers and they're useful and you can make tools out of them, but they're not finite individual numbers. So to get
all right.
at why we want a market, or what it's useful for, or like what its social function is, we could start off just by thinking of a closed system. So think of a village of like 10 different people, and very basic, no technology, no electricity, nothing like that. We're just talking about basics right now. So like food, water, shelter, clothes. That's basically it. Education is whatever people teach you about food, shelter, water, and clothes. So that's just our little
So
box
two
that we're
families,
using for our thought.
couple huts.
Yeah, call it two families. Ages dispersed, so a couple seniors, a couple babies, mostly in between. Everybody else is in between. Um, if you had everybody trying to procure their own needs, so that means that every unit of heat that comes from a fire, each individual had to procure that unit of heat for themselves. Everybody would spread out
Eh,
and go, gather wood or whatever every day. And every day they would go out and gather berries and bring them back. The reason why there could be an efficiency lost here is because if you think about the lumbermen, who that was their sole job and responsibility, they could plan out how to best go about gathering wood in an efficient way that benefits all people, not just themselves, because of their dedication and expertise in time. Now, to show an example of how that would work, rather than just randomly going out to the woods and picking from here and picking from there and picking from there, you could say, I'm going to chop all the wood in this area. Or let's say first you get a scope. You say, this is my entire area. And it takes 20 years to grow a tree. I'm going to cut all these trees down and divide all my land into 20 pieces. And every year I'm going to target one section of trees. So there are several areas of efficiency you're going to gain from this. One, you're getting all the trees in one area, so you're not wasting time traveling around just doing a walk here and there and about. The second benefit you're getting is you're making sure that there's continuity of tree growth, because after 20 years, you can cycle back to the beginning and you could start cutting down from the same spot again. And in theory, that would be an infinitely closed loop, because it does take time for trees to grow, but not an infinite amount of time. So being able to plan 20 years ahead and segment off parts of your land and also gather from all in the same spot without worrying about like completely deforesting the entire forest, because you've still got 19 other sections that are still fully grown and habitable to life and everything. That's a good idea of synergy right there, because what you're doing is, although that one person can't provide the food, clothing, and shelter for themselves, they're gathering enough wood for 10 other people, and they're working less to do it than everybody would have if you just added their energies together individually, going about different sections of the forest. So that's sort of the first little analogy to our series of analogies that I was going to get to, if you wanted to comment. Or
yeah. Sorry. This sounds a lot similar to something that I read. I believe it was in a Matt Ridley book. I think it was The Rational Optimist that he went into, where he saw the idea of trade itself as a driving force in early human civilization. By early human, he goes 2 or 3 million years back to when we were using hand axes, and he follows the evolution of the hand axe and how we made these Julian hand axes out of stone. So you kind of grip this sharp stone, and we made them in the same way for like 2 million years, the same proportions and the same, because this is what we do. So there's no progression past that. There was zero progress for like 2 million years almost, and all of a sudden they started changing. And we said things is that there was more than one. There became more and more hands at the work because of a climate change, because of accessibility to resources, but also the fact that humanity had spread out enough that we had able to encompass more places that had a greater number of resources, and there was now people that could start to specialize more and more. So all of a sudden you have tribes of, instead of 10 people, now you have tribes of 15 people spread out all over. When every once in a while they'll meet someone and they'll trade with each other, and all of a sudden they start making better hand axes. They start questioning how to make these hand axes, and they say, well, what if I made the point a little longer? What if I made the handle a little more comfortable? Because they can sit there and look at the rock and be like, this rock sucks. What if I made a better rock? Or what if I did this? Oh, that looks good. This works much better. I can slice instead of chop with this. Mm. And slowly you get bone tools coming up. So someone can sit there and scrimshaw with one of their knives and create fine needles. And with needles, you can get you can poke things. You can do all kinds of crazy stuff. You can make hooks, and then you can get fish, and then someone has to sit there and fish, and now that person can sit there and think while they fish, instead of just spearing at things, using all this energy, which they then have to replenish with eating that fish. So it uses a very poor use of calories. It's inefficient. So when you set like 6 lines out, you have all this fish bone lying around, and now you can make needles. And now, because you have these needles, what do you attach another specialization of thread, and all of a sudden you can make a net. And then you can throw the net in and catch a whole bunch of fish. That multiplies your thing. So, but then he says you find, he notes that you find needles and fish hooks and all these specialized manufacturing things from, this is like Paleolithic, Neolithic era still, 400 kilometers away. I don't remember if he said kilometers or miles. He's American, so maybe it was miles. But the idea was that one tribe would trade with another tribe right next to them, which would trade to another tribe right next to them. And these goods would move around this very slowly, but they would move around this Paleolithic marketplace. And so people in far inland of, say, in Europe, would be able to use fish hooks caught on the coast with fish specialists. So they'd have these fish tools made hundreds of miles away, because someone, and so they were able to, sorry, the point is that they were able to use the labor of someone 400 kilometers away, or 400 miles away, sorry, as their own thing. So now they had this tool that they could use for a whole bunch of stuff, which would make their acquisition of calories and shelter and water more efficient, which means they have now more time to devote to other things. And this happens slowly, but it multiplied itself, because as you get that efficiency increasing point by point, you get other progress. People start thinking, instead of how to build a better hand axe, well, what happens if I put a handle on it? What happens if I put a long handle on it? You get a spear. You get a big old spear. And then what happens if instead of just, putting a thing down and turning back, going back into the bush, and then they put a thing down and go into the bush, and then I go up and, that ancient trade practice, what if we just wrote things down? I make a...
Oh, you're getting ahead of us, though. You're getting ahead of us. Oh, you're on mute. Somehow.
I make a tally mark. How long was I on mute for?
Just 2 seconds.
Oh, I think I pressed my notebook.
That's all good.
Mute button. So essentially, he notes that trade was the thing that allowed us to specialize.
That's actually just what I'm
very
into, the specialization.
Yeah. So why don't you get into that then?
Yeah, because like the useful thing about markets is you sort of need specialists for the market to be useful first. So what we had gone to was the guy with the lumberman, or woman, either or, develops a system, and that's sort of their expertise in design or segregating or partitioning parts of the forest to cultivate resources from, and to free up the time of everybody else in the village, the other 10 people that are there. So now if you extend this same concept to the person cooking, being able to figure out which food is the most nutritious and how to cook it, and cooking it from a giant vat as opposed to cooking in individual pots for each portion meal, you can see how the lumberman's efficiencies or economics of trade can be transposed into a completely different field of study, which is nutrition and cooking, cuisine, culinary arts of the Paleolithic hominid we're speaking of. So I guess just to drill the point home, you could go into that person might be the more elderly who's less fit to go chop wood. It would be a person who's got the time and energy and the experience in life, having eaten for so many days of their lives compared to everyone else. They might be the best fit to prepare meals for the group. And the reason they prepare meals for the group is the same reason that the lumberman gets everybody's wood, the wood for the group, because they will end up working less with a greater quality outcome, and everyone benefits from it in the end without it taking away from the person who's doing the work. So the lumberman gets a benefit from everyone else's time being freed up. He gets to go home and get a more nutritious meal than he could have made for himself, absent the expertise.
Right, because less of the meat is wasted, so you take more off the bone. You know how to use the fat more effectively. Maybe you can get the marrow out and or use the bones, boil the bones more effectively.
Or the time to
you throw less away.
Outside and salted and smoked, and like all these flavors and spices and berries that you could be adding to it. That, if you had to do everything for yourself and you were doing all these inefficient processes all throughout your day, everything would be done half-assed, basically, because there's just aren't enough time in a day to master every single skill. That sort of gets to mastery. And extending that from the cook to the lumberman, you can go into the tool maker, as you were getting at with the fish hooks. Now the fisherman and the fish hook specialist, or whatever you want to call them, will probably need energy from the woodsman and food from the cuisine master, and they would in turn provide a greater benefit to the entire group of 10 in this small society, being that they can produce those nets and sewing utensils. And then you could have a seamstress who helps with the clothes, because we're still talking about just people's basic needs, right? food, water, shelter. And then, of course, you transpose that to somebody who builds homes. So I think we've drilled it to death, but it's really important because this is the founding principle, the reason why we have markets and economics and subsidies and incentives and supply and demand. The reason all of these economic principles exist is specifically to encourage and extract synergies from each other's work. It's not to step on someone else to get more than them, and it's not to say that everybody has to be poor because that's just fair and equal. It's not about that. The entire point, completely agnostic to the outcome, is to get the best possible outcome, whatever that outcome is. It has nothing to do with stopping billionaires from being billionaires, and it has nothing to do with people being given handouts just staying poor because they're lazy. That's not economics. That's people's political beliefs and faiths, and they might be based on their ideas of economics, but it's not economics in and of itself. That sort of takes us to why we have a market, though, because as your society grows and ranges of expertise are expanded upon, that's when we get into what you're talking about, where it makes sense to have a central location to be able to exchange and trade people's different expertise, because that lumberman might be able to make more than his or her own town needs, but they might need something from another town like ore, and they might be on the coast. So they've got fish, they need ore from somewhere else. You can exchange ore. And this is where supply and demand, the curves, the idea that there are a finite number of fish that are caught, not necessarily that there are a finite number of fish in the world, but I mean, for all intents and purposes, the ocean's pretty big, and we're talking about a civilization of 20 people. So it's pretty much infinite in this case, just for our thought experiment. But the reason we have a marketplace is to bring goods to a single place, because it would be, once again, woefully inefficient to have people going from house to house selling things. And we did do that, and we still do it in some things. You'll see vacuum salesmen, encyclopedia salesmen from the 90s and before that. And, house to house sales is still a thing, believe it or not, because some things are actually more efficient to sell individually. But you need a really big society for there to be a small number of people who need something that doesn't need to be in a marketplace. So generally what we're going to talk about is a market being a place to bring goods to one spot, so that people looking for objects know where to go. Even if they don't know specifically what they want, they know where to go to find anything. And people who have any product know exactly where to go to offload it without having to randomly go from town to town and say, you need wood, you need wood, you need wood, you need wood. So there's an efficiency of the efficiency. And that's sort of where we start getting these tiers of economies. And that's what we talk about, economies of scale, as another one of our jargon words, but we haven't covered yet. But I think before we get into economies of scale, maybe you want to elaborate further on the trade and the benefits of, or any other comments you might have on that.
You put it quite well. Especially on such a small scale. Now, I think a lot of this, one thing to note is that the role of communication itself is a commodity, or not so much commodity, but a tool that you can use. And back then you could have gone up to the next town, or like you're a town on the coast, and you know like 3 other towns around you maybe, or 3 other villages or tribes around you. And you could go to them. It's like, I've got a bunch of extra wood. I guess pass it to the people and tell them that if anyone needs wood down the line. And then maybe 3 years later, you get someone being like, hey, you still got a ton of wood? And the message comes back. Whereas nowadays, we can just be like, dear internet, I've got a bunch of lumber in my backyard. And 30 seconds later, being like, I love lumber. It's just like, well, yeah, exactly. You got almost too much down the pipeline. Now, this comes from there being more people to sell to, but that communication in itself also plays a factor. So you're not necessarily needing to go town to town, but you only have 3 other villages maybe, or 4, and one that's definitely hostile to you, which is another thing, is that neighboring tribes weren't always to be trusted. you have a nice little calm, quiet village, but these are not people that are trading in a peaceful market. The market can easily be succumb to raiders who think that they can make more money taking from others rather than trading and working, which has always been a thing. The economy of plunder versus an economy of the market. Plunder just being go and take it, Viking economies. That and I guess a slave economy would also be the opposition to this, where you have multiple hands not making lighter work because one person has 1,000 hands doing one thing, and those extra hands don't do anything else, and they have no specialization. So it doesn't actually provide extra value, which is why slavery doesn't work.
Yeah.
So
you've actually, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, you touched on a huge thing here. I wanted to just highlight actually.
Sorry.
When talking about security between tribes and things like that, or not tribes, but
Small units.
Foreign markets, we'll call them, invading and looting, plundering. That to me is fundamentally a sign that those people haven't understood the economic gains of synergy. And that's sort of why I wanted to talk about this today, because a lot of people still have that mentality where we need to kill people who think differently than us. Whereas I believe that all violence and war can be rationalized away because economics is sound principle. And as long as everybody understood it from the ground up, from this village thought experiment type of way, there would be no reason to rob your neighbor or to rob another marketplace. And I think that's sort of where I was going to take the next step of this was from markets, we're going to develop a system of rules, and rule includes law enforcement and stuff. But those rules are sort of, it's an abstraction from the expertise of the wood gatherer to the expertise of the marketplace, the abstraction of where all goods and experts come to place their markets for sale. A layer of abstraction on top of that would be the rules and adherence to those rules to help a functioning marketplace continue and maintain to function, just like having those segments of your forest rationed to encourage longevity of your wood collecting.
Yeah, no fight air. This is a marketplace where we come to trade. No duels, no fights,
no
theft, wooden
fair
shoes.
Price. But that means we have to agree on things like mediums of exchange, value of goods, rules to returns, false advertising, misleading. All of these types of little tiny minutiae require some person's expertise to manage and maintain and sort of curate to make sure anytime there is sort of a lopsided balance that it gets corrected.
Well, and as we go, we discovered the way things work differently. Like right now is the perfect time because we're discovering all these new things that these new technologies are allowing us to do. So we have to make new rules. So like gouging in the internet or
privacy rules.
But like in the past, you had like very simple rules. I remember it was was it Lublin or was it Lubeck or the Hanseatic League where there was a meeting where they weren't allowed to wear clogs because they could be used as a weapon in meetings. So
that's my kind of meeting.
Yeah. So apparently someone had taken off their shoes and beaten somebody to death to death. This is let's not take our modern squeamishness and put that aside for a bit, because trading is you do want to maximize your end of the deal, and so people are going to take advantage of that because you want to end up with the most efficient because you know what you want and the other person wants what they want, so you want to make it so that you get the best deal. Now, the best deal in my thought is the one that benefits all parties to the maximum amount, so that you can continue to do business, because business later is more business than just business now, which is why plunder doesn't work. You're doing business.
It's even more important, actually.
Yeah, because if you're a Viking, you're doing business with a hostile territory, and the business is literally just you give me your stuff and I kill you. But the thing is that you can't do business with them, and they won't be able to make more stuff for you to take after that. It's a one-time purchase,
Yeah.
and you are purchasing it, yes, with violence, but you're also risking your life. So it's not without risk, and life also ends. And once you end, you can't do any more trading, and you can't, provide for all your people back in, the north, in Scandinavia there. So it's a bad deal. But if you create relationships and you make it so that no swords. Also, if we find out that you're raiding within any of the, if you make a deal and then you raid the shipment after and get your stuff back, well, okay. So if we find out you did that, we'll break your bench and we'll make you bankrupt, which is where that comes from. So you no longer have a seat at that marketplace when you don't play by the rules. Is essentially what bankrupt meant. And
that's a crucial point of note too, because being ostracized from the marketplace means that you no longer get to benefit from a lot of the efficiencies that the marketplace provides everybody. So the reason the market exists is because it's beneficial to everybody. Like, that's why we all agree to the laws, even though it limits our freedoms to kill other people. At least we don't need to kill any people anymore. So
right.
it's in the whole, it's a greater good than the cost of adherence.